It is the middle of the night, and it is raining as though the sky means to drown the island, and out in the black jungle beyond the thin line of marines, thousands of enemy soldiers are massing to attack. It is the 24th of October, 1942, on Guadalcanal, and a single American battalion, perhaps 700 men, is spread desperately thin across a front far too long for its numbers, dug into the mud in front of the airfield. That is the whole reason anyone is fighting for this miserable island at all. Behind them is the airfield. If they break, it falls, and coming at them through the rain and the dark is an entire enemy regiment, many times their number, determined to overrun them before dawn. Somewhere along that line, moving through the worst of it, is the man who is going to hold it together by sheer force of will. He is a short, barrel-chested colonel with a voice like gravel, and this night is going to make him a legend. Before we go on, if stories like this one matter to you, please take a moment to subscribe. It genuinely helps us keep the memory of these men alive and reach more people who care about them. Thank you. Now, back to that flooded line on Guadalcanal and to the colonel holding it in the dark. To understand that night, you have to understand the man, because the line held that night for one reason above all others, and the reason was him. He was not a general directing from a map miles behind the front. He was right there on the firing line, in the mud and the rain, with the rifle companies, close enough to the enemy to be killed. And his men could hear his voice in the dark, steady and profane, and utterly unafraid, and it did for them what nothing else could have done. It told them that if he was still standing there, they could stand there too. He was the kind of leader who is mostly a myth in war, the one who is actually where he asks his men to be, and this was the night he proved it beyond any doubt. His name was Louis Puller, and the Marines called him Chesty for the barrel chest and the ramrod bearing. And by the end of the war and the one after it, he would be the most decorated Marine in the history of the Corps, a man whose name is still spoken in Marine barracks every night. Everything you are about to hear is documented in his Navy Cross citation for that night, in the Marine Corps records of the battle, in the memories of the men who were on that line with him. He was real. The night was real, and what one determined man can do to hold a breaking line has rarely been shown more clearly than it was by Chesty Puller in the rain on Guadalcanal. Louis Puller was not a big man, and he was not a polished one. He was short and thick through the chest, with a jutting jaw and a gravel voice, and he had come up the hard way, through years of small, brutal jungle campaigns in the Caribbean between the wars, learning his trade in actual gunfights while other officers polished their careers at desks. He had already earned decorations for valor before this war ever started. He had contempt, open and lifelong, for staff officers and rear echelon comfort, and a devotion equally open to the ordinary enlisted Marine, the rifleman in the mud, whom he considered the only person in any army who actually mattered. His men worshipped him, and they worshipped him for concrete reasons, not vague ones. He shared everything they endured. He ate what they ate, and slept where they slept, and stood where they stood. He looked after them ferociously, fought the supply system and the higher command on their behalf, and spent their lives when he to spend them with visible pain and never with carelessness. And he led from the front, always close enough to the fighting to be hit, because he believed that was the only place a commander had any business being. A Marine who served under Chesty Puller knew, with total certainty, that his colonel would never ask him to go anywhere. The colonel himself would not go first. That certainty is worth more than any number of men, and on the night of the 24th of October, it was worth everything. Guadalcanal in the autumn of 1942 was the hinge of the entire Pacific War, and everyone on it, on both sides, knew it. The Americans had landed and seized a half-built airfield, named it Henderson Field, and then found themselves clinging to it, under strength and half-starved and racked with malaria, while the Japanese poured men and ships in to take it back. Whoever held that airfield controlled the skies over the southern Pacific. The fighting for it was some of the most savage of the war, in a green hell of jungle and disease, and by late October, the Japanese had gathered a powerful force to make a determined, all-out effort to break through and retake the field once and for all. The ground where they chose to make their main push was held that night by Puller's battalion, and by a cruel accident of numbers, his single battalion was covering a front meant for a much larger force, a line so long and so thin that in places there was barely a man every few yards. He knew how exposed he was. He had walked the line and seen it, and he knew, from the patrols and the sounds in the jungle, that something very large was coming for exactly this stretch, in the dark, in the rain that night. He arranged his too few men as best he could, sighted his machine guns, registered his artillery, and waited, because there was nothing else to do but wait and hold. They came after dark, in the driving rain, and they came in enormous numbers, throwing themselves at the thin marine line in wave after wave through the night. The fighting was at the closest and most terrible range, in the mud and the dark, the Marines firing until their weapons jammed and clearing them, and firing again, the machine guns burning through belt after belt of ammunition, the whole line a single desperate struggle to hold back a tide of men that kept coming no matter how many fell. In one part of the sector, a sergeant named John Bassalone worked his machine guns past the point of exhaustion, and into legend, one piece of a fight full of such moments. And up and down the line, in the worst of it, moved the colonel. Fuller did what he had always done. He moved along his own firing line, in the open, through the rain and the fire, going from position to position, steadying men, plugging gaps, sending his slender reserves exactly where they were needed, at exactly the moment they were needed, reading the battle in the dark by sound and instinct. When the pressure threatened to break through, he called for artillery, and then he called it in closer, and closer still, danger close, the shells landing so near his own line that they threatened his own men, because that was what it took to break up the assaults, and he judged, correctly and coldly, that it was worth the risk. His voice carried along the line all night, and wherever it carried, the line held. And it is right to say clearly who was coming at them, because they deserve it. The Japanese soldiers who charged that line again and again through the rain were brave men, extraordinarily brave, throwing themselves into massed fire with a courage and a devotion to their own cause that their enemies never doubted. They were not fanatics to be sneered at. They were soldiers doing something almost unbearably hard, dying by the hundreds for their country and their emperor, on a muddy hillside far off from home, and the Marines who killed them that night, and who would have been killed by them had the line broken, understood that they were fighting men as brave as themselves. There is no honor in pretending the enemy was less than he was. The honor of holding that line is greater because of how hard the men trying to break it fought. By dawn, it was over, and the line had held. It had held all night, against everything the enemy could throw at it, and the airfield behind it was safe, and the bodies of the attackers lay in heaps in front of the Marine positions, a measure of how close it had been, and how hard both sides had fought. Puller's battalion, 700 men stretched impossibly thin, had stopped a regiment. It was one of the decisive defensive stands of the entire Guadalcanal campaign, and everyone who was there knew who had made it possible. The colonel had held them together with his own presence all night in the rain, and they had done the rest. And they gave him a Navy Cross for that night, and it was neither his first nor his last. But the medal is not really the point of Chesty Puller, and he would have been the first to say so. The point of him was the thing that made that night possible, the bond between him and the men he led, a bond built out of the plainest materials. He was brave in front of them. He shared their light to them. He never wasted them. And he was always, always where the danger was worst. Men will do impossible things for a leader like that, and Puller's men did impossible things, again and again across the whole war. He was not a gentle man or an easy one. He was hard, blunt, sometimes reckless with his own life to a degree that frightened his superiors, and his aggressiveness in later battles would be questioned by some who thought it cost too many lives. He was a real and complicated soldier, not a poster, but whatever else was true of him, this was true first, that he loved the enlisted Marine with his whole heart and led him from the front with total courage, and the Corps knew it, and loved him back and has never stopped. To this day, in Marine barracks, recruits are told to say good night to Chesty Puller, wherever he is. No higher thing exists in that service. There are 100 stories about him, and most of them are true, and they all say the same thing. He turned down comforts that were his by rank and handed them to his men. He raged at commanders who spent Marines carelessly from safe distances. He walked his lines constantly, learning his men's names and their hometowns, so that they were never just numbers to him. When a higher headquarters issued an order he thought would get his men killed for nothing, he said so bluntly, to their faces, and did not much care what it cost his career. He was, in the truest sense, the Marines' colonel, theirs, on their side, one of them, and they knew it in their bones, and it made them capable of things no ordinary battalion could do. The night on Guadalcanal was one stand among many in a career that became the standard against which Marine courage is measured. Puller fought across the Pacific, at Cape Gloucester and in the meat grinder of Peleliu, where his regiment was nearly destroyed taking a ridge, and where his relentlessness became a matter of hard debate, the terrible arithmetic of a commander who would not stop. Over his career, in campaigns stretching back before the war and forward past it, he was awarded the Navy Cross 5 separate times, more than any other Marine in history, along with a chestful of other decorations. No one has ever matched the record. It is unlikely anyone ever will. He rose, in time, to general, but he never became a different kind of man than the colonel on the line at Guadalcanal. He stayed blunt, stayed devoted to the rifleman, stayed contemptuous of comfort and ceremony, stayed exactly himself. And when he finally left the Corps, he left behind not just a record of medals, but something rarer, a legend that the Marines took entirely into themselves, the image of the leader who is always at the front, who never asks what he will not do, who belongs to his men and to whom his men belong. That is what Chesty became, and the night in the rain on Guadalcanal is one of the truest places to see how he earned it. Long after this war was over, the legend only grew. He fought again in the next one, in Korea, at the frozen Chosin Reservoir, surrounded and outnumbered, and made the grim remark that follows him still, that being surrounded on all sides simply meant the enemy could not get away from him this time. By the time he had finally retired, he had become less a man than a standard, the measure other Marines are held to, and the Corps folded him permanently into its own soul. Young Marines who never met him, born long after he died, are taught his name and his story, and the old tradition endures in the barracks at night. The last words called into the dark, a whole service refusing, generation after generation, to let him go. It would be easy to make him a cartoon, the tough-talking Marine of 100 barrack stories, and that would miss what actually mattered about him. What mattered was that on the worst night, on the thinnest line, with everything depending on men not breaking, he was there, in person, in the mud, sharing the exact danger he was asking them to face, and that his being there was the difference between a line that held and a line that broke. Leadership, at the sharpest end, is not a theory or a diagram. It is a specific human being standing in a specific terrible place and refusing to leave, so that the men around him can find it in themselves to stay too. That is what he did. So remember the line in the rain, and the 700 who held it, and the thousands of brave men on the other side who died trying to break it, because all of them belonged to that night. But remember, above all, the short, gravel-voiced colonel moving along the firing line in the dark, calling the guns in on top of himself, holding an impossible position together by the simple, enormous fact of his own presence. He did not hold that line with medals or with speeches. He held it with his body, standing where it was worst, so his Marines would stand there too. That is why they still say his name every night. He was the most decorated Marine who ever lived, and he earned all of it the same way, at the front with his men refusing to break. Good night, Chesty, wherever you are.